A quiet neighborhood stirs. Betty Thompson hummed softly to herself, her arthritic hands carefully trimming the rose bushes in her garden. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass, and she felt a familiar sense of peace within her. For as long as she could remember, gardening had been her solace, a way to occupy the long, quiet days since her husband, George, had passed. Now, at 82, her garden had become her closest companion, each flower a vibrant reminder of the life she had built here over the years. The neighborhood had changed so much since she and George had moved in. Back then, children played outside until dusk, and families gathered for block parties in the summer. But most of her neighbors had either moved or passed on. The street had fallen silent, with only the occasional passerby to break the stillness. She hadn't spoken to anyone in days, and as much as she treasured her independence, she sometimes missed the laughter and conversations that once filled the air. Just as Betty reached for her watering can, a low rumble caught her attention. She looked up, squinting at the road. A large, unfamiliar moving truck was inching down the street. Betty's heart lifted. New neighbors. It had been ages since someone new had moved into the neighborhood, and she couldn't help but feel a spark of curiosity. As the truck parked outside the vacant house next door, Betty leaned on her garden rake, watching intently. She saw a woman climb out first, a young lady in her 30s, with a warm smile and an air of quiet grace. Her dark skin contrasted beautifully against the light-colored dress she wore, and her eyes scanned the house with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Behind her were two young girls, each no older than 6, with identical curly hair that bounced as they clambered out of the truck. Twins. Betty's heart warmed at the sight. She hadn't seen children around here in years. She could already imagine the sound of laughter returning to the street, breaking the silence that had taken root. As the twins hopped out, they clutched each other's hands, their wide eyes absorbing their surroundings. Their gazes fell on Betty, and the three of them locked eyes. Betty gave a gentle wave, and the girls hesitated before offering shy smiles. But before Betty could make her way over to greet them, the last person stepped out of the truck. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and imposing, his face set in a stern expression. His piercing gaze swept the neighborhood as though sizing up every house, and Betty felt her smile fade a little. There was something about him that unsettled her, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. The man walked over to the woman, murmuring something she couldn't hear, and his hand tightened around her arm in a way that made Betty's stomach twist. The family slowly made their way inside, and Betty's curiosity turned to concern as she noticed the twins glancing back at her with a hint of something she hadn't expected. Fear. It was subtle, a fleeting look that was quickly replaced with blank expressions. Betty shook her head, telling herself it was nothing. Moving could be stressful, especially with young children. As the truck drove away, Betty continued with her gardening, but her mind wandered back to the new neighbors. She wondered what their story was, why they had arrived with barely any belongings, and if they were planning to stay. Her years in this neighborhood had taught her that every family brought with them their own joys, struggles, and secrets. And perhaps, just perhaps, this family had more of the latter. That night, as Betty settled into her well-worn armchair, her mind drifted back to the girls. She thought of the fear in their eyes, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. Yet, as she sipped her tea, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about them. Something she couldn't ignore. The sound in the night. The night air was still, wrapping Betty's quiet home in a comforting silence. After an evening spent knitting and watching an old favorite movie, she had made her way to bed, hoping to drift into a restful sleep. But as she lay beneath the worn quilt, Betty couldn't shake the day's strange events from her mind. The new family, the twins' fleeting looks of fear, and the stern-faced man. She tossed and turned, her thoughts weaving countless questions and imaginary answers. Somewhere in the midst of these thoughts, she drifted off to sleep, but the silence was shattered not long after by a loud, sudden noise, a slam, sharp and unmistakable. echoing through the quiet street. Betty's eyes flew open, her heart thumping. She sat up, straining to listen in the darkness. She knew her neighbors well, or at least she knew the silence each house typically held at night. This noise didn't belong. It had come from the direction of the house next door. Then, faintly, she heard what sounded like voices. No, not voices. Cries. High-pitched and panicked. The sounds twisted through the night, soft yet unmistakable in the stillness. Betty held her breath, waiting, hoping that perhaps it was only a bad dream or a passing moment of confusion. But then came another noise, a voice, deep and angry, carrying through the night. Betty slowly climbed out of bed, her joints protesting as she pulled on a warm sweater and slippers. She moved to her window, lifting the edge of the curtain to peer outside. The night was thick with shadows, the faint glow of streetlights barely illuminating the houses across the street. She could see the dark outline of the house next door, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement in one of the upper windows. A small figure, perhaps, but she couldn't be sure. Betty took a deep breath, her fingers trembling against the windowsill. What could she do? She was just an old woman, and it wasn't her place to interfere in other people's business. But a persistent feeling gnawed at her, whispering that this wasn't something she could ignore. Those twins, so young and fragile, haunted her mind's eye, their small faces etched with an expression far too heavy for children. As she stood there, debating, the sounds abruptly stopped. Silence fell once more, a sudden and unnerving quiet that made the night feel heavier. Betty remained at the window, watching, waiting for any sign that might explain the strange noises. But there was nothing. No more cries, no shadowed figures, just an eerie calm. Finally, Betty let the curtain fall and returned to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. She lay awake for hours, her mind racing, wondering if she had imagined it all. When she finally did drift off, it was into restless dreams filled with shadows and muffled voices. The morning sun crept through her curtains, and Betty awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented. She had almost convinced herself that the events of the night had been a dream, a strange trick of her tired mind. But as she moved through her morning routine, making tea and buttering toast, she couldn't shake the unease that lingered. After breakfast, she decided to pay her new neighbors a visit. Perhaps a friendly gesture would ease her mind and allow her to see for herself that everything was all right. She would bring a small loaf of her famous banana bread as a welcome gift, something simple and warm, a gesture of neighborly kindness. Betty carefully wrapped the bread in a tea towel, placed it in a small basket, and made her way next door. She hesitated on the doorstep, her hand hovering over the doorbell, feeling an odd mixture of nerves and resolve. Finally, she pressed the bell, hearing it chime softly inside. The door opened after a few moments, and there stood the woman she had seen yesterday, dressed in a simple blouse and jeans. Up close, Betty noticed the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, and something deeper, an anxiety that she tried to mask with a polite smile. "Oh, hello," the woman greeted, her voice soft, but with a hint of surprise. "Good morning, dear," Betty said warmly, holding out the basket. "I'm Betty from next door. I thought I'd bring over a little something to welcome you all to the neighborhood." The woman's face softened, and she took the basket, her smile a bit more genuine now. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. That's so kind of you. I'm Melanie, by the way." "Lovely to meet you, Melanie," Betty replied. She hesitated, then added, "I hope you're settling in all right. Moving can be such a challenge, especially with little ones." Melanie's eyes flickered, and for a split second, Betty saw something like sadness in her expression. "Yes, it's been a bit of an adjustment," she admitted. "The girls are having a hard time, but they're troopers." Before Betty could ask anything further, a shadow loomed behind Melanie. The man appeared, his face as unwelcoming as before. He placed a hand on Melanie's shoulder, squeezing just a little too firmly. "Who's this?" he asked, his voice curt. Betty forced a smile, ignoring the warning bells that rang in her head. I'm Betty from next door. Just wanted to say hello and welcome you all to the neighborhood." The man's gaze was hard, his lips barely curving into a smile. "That's nice of you, but we're quite busy. Maybe another time." Melanie's face fell, her eyes dropping to the floor, and Betty's heart went out to her. But she knew there was nothing more she could do here. Not now, at least. "Of course," she said, nodding politely. "If you need anything, I'm just a few steps away." The man nodded, and with a brief, forced smile, he closed the door. Betty walked back to her house, the sense of dread sitting heavy in her chest. Her instincts, sharpened by years of motherhood and community, told her that something was wrong. She had seen the way Melanie's shoulders slumped when her partner had appeared, the slight tremor in her hands. And those girls, the fear she had seen in their eyes was not the product of a child's imagination. Back in her own kitchen, Betty paced, glancing out the window every so often at the quiet house next door. She felt helpless, caught between her worry for the family and the limitations of her role as a neighbor. Yet, the fear she had seen in the girl's eyes lingered in her thoughts. As the afternoon wore on, Betty returned to her garden, hoping the familiar work would ease her mind. But as she trimmed her roses, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned to see the twins standing on the edge of her yard, their faces partially hidden behind a small shrub. Betty felt her heart lurch. She straightened up and waved, hoping to encourage them to come closer. Slowly, hesitantly, they stepped forward, their small hands clasped tightly together. Betty knelt down, her knees protesting, and offered them a gentle smile. "Hello, my dears," she said softly. "Are you all right?" The girls exchanged a look, and the older of the two, a little bolder, spoke first. Are you Mrs. Thompson?" Betty nodded. "Yes, that's right. And you must be my new neighbors." She kept her voice light, not wanting to scare them. "What are your names?" "I'm Leela. And this is my sister, Ivy," the girl said quietly. Her voice was barely a whisper, as if she feared someone might overhear. "Those are beautiful names," Betty replied, warmth filling her voice. "Are you settling in okay?" The girls didn't answer, but Betty noticed their small hands tightening, their faces tense. She waited, allowing them the time they needed, sensing that they wanted to say something but were struggling to find the courage. Finally, Ivy, the quieter of the two, glanced around, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Thompson, we're not supposed to talk to people." Betty's heart broke at the words, and she reached out, gently placing a hand on Ivy's shoulder. "That's all right, dear. You're safe here. You can talk to me if you'd like." The girls looked at each other again. And then, in a voice trembling with fear, Leela said, "We're scared of him. He doesn't like us." Betty felt a chill run through her heart aching at the fear in their eyes. She couldn't stand by and do nothing. "Listen, if you ever need anything at all, you just come to me, all right?" The girls nodded, gratitude flickering in their eyes, and then they quickly darted back toward their house, glancing back at her once before disappearing through the side door. Betty remained in her garden, staring after them, her mind racing. Whatever was happening in that house was not normal, and the girl's words had confirmed her worst fears. Something had to be done, a silent cry for help. Betty spent the rest of the day in a haze of worry and doubt, replaying the conversation with the twins over and over in her mind. She kept picturing their small, fearful faces and the quiet desperation in their eyes. The phrase, "He doesn't like us," echoed through her thoughts, filling her with a gnawing dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that these children were in danger, that they were enduring something no child should have to face. As the evening drew near, Betty tried to distract herself with her usual routines, watching her favorite cooking show, preparing a light supper, and sitting down with a hot cup of chamomile tea. But her mind kept wandering back to the family next door, especially to the girls' terrified expressions and the cold, unyielding look of their father. She had tried to convince herself that it wasn't her place to interfere, that perhaps she was just letting her imagination get the better of her. But deep down, She knew this was more than her mind playing tricks. Later that night, just as she was settling down with a book, Betty heard the unmistakable sounds of raised voices coming from the house next door. Her hands tightened around her book as she strained to listen. The voices were muffled, the words indecipherable, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, frustration, and something that sounded dangerously close to fear. Betty's heart began to race, her mind filling with images of what might be happening behind those walls. She could hear the man's voice, loud and authoritative, a tone that left no room for opposition. Then, faintly, she heard another voice, Melanie's, softer and pleading, though she couldn't make out the words. And finally, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the distinct, high-pitched cries of the twins. Without thinking, Betty moved to her window, peeking out through the curtains to see if she could get a glimpse of what was happening. The house was dark, the curtains drawn tightly, and there was no sign of movement. But the sounds continued, muffled by the walls yet clear enough to convey the distress within. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. What could she do? She didn't want to intrude, but she couldn't just ignore the cries of those children. The thought of calling the police crossed her mind, but then she hesitated. What if she was wrong? What if she was misinterpreting the situation, blowing things out of proportion? The last thing she wanted was to cause trouble for her neighbors over what might be a misunderstanding. Yet, as the minutes passed, the sounds from the house grew louder, more desperate. Betty felt a surge of determination rise within her. She couldn't just sit here, listening to this nightmare unfold. Those children needed help, and if she was wrong, well, she'd rather risk a little embarrassment than live with the regret of doing nothing. Betty took a deep breath and picked up her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed 911. The line rang once, twice, and then a calm voice answered, 911. What's your emergency? Betty hesitated, feeling a strange sense of guilt and fear, but she steadied her voice and spoke. Hello, I'm not sure if this is an emergency, but I'm very concerned about my neighbors, especially the children. I heard yelling and crying. It doesn't sound right. The dispatcher listened patiently as Betty explained the situation, recounting the strange encounters she'd had with the family and the fear she had seen in the twins' eyes. She described the unsettling events of the past day, trying to convey her concerns without sounding overly dramatic. Thank you for reporting this, ma'am, the dispatcher said, her tone serious. We take reports of potential child endangerment very seriously. I'll dispatch an officer to check on the situation. Please remain in your home and do not attempt to approach the house. Betty nodded, though the dispatcher couldn't see her, and whispered, Thank you. As she hung up the phone, a mixture of relief and anxiety washed over her. She had taken the first step, but now came the hardest part, waiting. She paced her small living room, glancing out the window every few minutes, watching for any sign of the police. The neighborhood was silent, an eerie calm settling over the street. She tried to occupy herself with household chores, dusting the bookshelves, straightening the cushions on the couch, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the twins, their small, frightened faces flashing in her mind. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of sirens broke the silence. Betty rushed to the window and saw a police car slowly pulling up to the curb in front of the house next door. 2 officers stepped out, their faces obscured by the shadows, and approached the door. Betty held her breath, watching as they knocked and waited. The door opened, and she saw Melanie standing there, her face pale in the glow of the porch light. She spoke to the officers for a few moments, nodding and gesturing toward the house. Betty couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see the tension in Melanie's posture, the way her shoulders slumped as she spoke. The officers disappeared inside, and Betty's heart pounded as she waited, her mind racing with possibilities. What would they find? Would they be able to help the girls? She felt an overwhelming urge to do something, anything, to make sure the twins were safe, but all she could do was watch and hope. The minutes stretched on, and finally, the officers reappeared. accompanied by Melanie, and to Betty's relief, the twins. The girls clung to their mother, their faces buried against her sides, and Betty could see that they were trembling. The officers spoke to Melanie for a few more moments, then returned to their car. As the police car pulled away, Betty felt a surge of frustration and helplessness. It seemed that whatever the officers had found, it hadn't been enough to intervene. She watched as Melanie gently guided the girls back into the house, her face etched with an expression Betty couldn't quite decipher, a mix of relief and fear. The street fell silent once more, and Betty felt a crushing sense of defeat. She had done what she could, but it hadn't been enough. She turned away from the window, feeling the weight of her age pressing down on her. She was just an old woman with no power, no way to protect those girls from whatever they were going through. But as she made her way back to her chair, she heard a soft tapping sound. Startled, she turned and saw a small figure standing outside her window, looking in. Her heart leaped as she recognized Leela, one of the twins, her small hand pressed against the glass, her eyes wide and pleading. Without a second thought, Betty opened the door and ushered the girl inside. Lila's face was pale, her hands shaking as she clung to Betty's hand. She looked up at Betty, her eyes brimming with tears. "Mrs. Thompson," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Please help us. He's going to hurt us." Betty's heart broke at the words, and she gently pulled the girl into a comforting embrace, stroking her hair and whispering soothing words. "You're safe here, darling," she said softly. "I won't let anyone hurt you." For a moment, Leela allowed herself to be comforted, but then she pulled back, her face filled with fear. "We have to go back. If he finds out I'm here." Betty felt a surge of protectiveness rise within her. She couldn't let this child go back into that house, not after what she had just heard. But before she could say anything, she heard footsteps approaching from outside, heavy and purposeful. The sound filled her with dread, and she quickly pulled Lila to the side, motioning for her to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and for a moment, there was only silence. Betty held her breath, hoping that whoever it was would go away. But then came a loud, forceful knock, and a voice, deep and menacing, called out, "Mrs. Thompson, open the door. I know my daughter is in there." Betty's heart raced as she looked down at Leela, her mind scrambling for a way to protect her. She knew she was facing a dangerous situation, but her resolve hardened. She would not let this man harm Leela or Ivy, not if she could help it. Taking a deep breath, Betty moved toward the door, her voice steady as she called out, "I'll open the door, but you'll leave her alone. Do you understand?" There was a moment of silence, then the voice replied, cold and unyielding, "We'll see about that." As she prepared to confront him, Betty felt a surge of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She was no longer just an old woman. She was a protector, a shield for the innocent, and she was prepared to do whatever it took to keep Leela safe. A dangerous confrontation. Betty's hand shook as she reached for the door. She could feel Leela's small, trembling hand clutching the back of her cardigan, hiding just out of sight. The fear in the little girl's eyes was enough to steel her resolve, but as she turned the doorknob, she couldn't ignore the chill of dread that ran down her spine. Outside, the man stood with an air of dominance, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture radiating impatience and irritation. He was even taller and more imposing than Betty had remembered, his eyes cold and assessing as he glared down at her. "Mrs. Thompson, is it?" he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Betty forced herself to stand tall, meeting his gaze with a calm she barely felt. "If you're talking about Leela," she replied firmly, "she came to me because she was frightened. I think it would be best if we took a moment to talk, Mr. Tom," he snapped. "And there's nothing to discuss. My daughter has no business here. She knows the rules." Betty's stomach churned at his words, her protective instincts flaring. She glanced over her shoulder at Leela, whose face was pale and streaked with fresh tears. The child looked like she was on the verge of collapse, her eyes pleading with Betty not to send her back. Betty felt a surge of anger she hadn't experienced in years. No child should be forced to endure such fear, especially not in their own home. "She's just a little girl," Betty said, her voice stronger than she expected. "Children don't run away from home unless they're truly afraid. She needs comfort, not punishment." Tom's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint flashing in them. He took a step forward, towering over Betty, his tone cold and biting. "With all due respect, Mrs. Thompson, you don't know anything about what my family needs, and you certainly don't have the right to interfere. Now hand her over before this gets unpleasant." Betty felt her heart race, but she didn't back down. She glanced at Leela, giving her a reassuring nod before turning her gaze back to Tom. "I won't let her go until I know she's safe," she said, her voice unwavering. "If you're a responsible father, then you should understand that children sometimes need someone to protect them, someone to keep them safe from harm, even if that harm comes from within their own home." For a moment, Tom simply stared at her, his face expressionless. But Betty noticed his fists clench at his sides, and a cold anger flickered in his eyes. She could sense the barely contained rage simmering beneath his composed exterior, and it frightened her. But she held her ground, refusing to give in to his intimidation. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, Melanie appeared behind Tom, her face pale and anxious. She placed a tentative hand on his arm, her eyes pleading. "Tom, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Let's just talk this through. Maybe we can find a way to make this right." Tom shot her a withering glare, but something in her gaze seemed to soften him, if only for a moment. He released a sharp exhale, his expression hardening as he turned back to Betty. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll talk. But don't think for a second that this changes anything." He stepped back, his gaze flickering to Leela, who was still clinging to Betty's cardigan, her small body trembling. "Leela, go to your mother," he ordered, his tone cold and final. Betty placed a comforting hand on Leela's shoulder, feeling the little girl tense under her touch. She crouched down to her level, meeting her frightened gaze. "It's all right, sweetheart," she murmured gently. "Why don't you go with your mother for a moment? I'll be right here." Leela hesitated, casting a wary glance at Tom, but Betty's soothing words seemed to give her a bit of courage. She nodded and slowly walked over to Melanie, who wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. Betty straightened up, meeting Tom's gaze with a quiet strength. She motioned for him to step back from the door, and he reluctantly complied, allowing her to step outside. They moved a few steps away from the house, out of earshot of Melanie and Leela. Tom folded his arms over his chest, his expression dark. "I'm only doing this out of respect for you, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his tone barely concealing his irritation. "But let me be clear, I don't appreciate outsiders meddling in my family's affairs." Betty met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I understand that, Tom," she replied evenly. "But I'm not just any outsider. I've lived here for decades and I've seen a lot in my time. I know what fear looks like. And those girls, especially Leela, they're terrified. Whatever is happening in your home, it's affecting them deeply." Tom scoffed, rolling his eyes. "You're reading too much into this. They're just kids. They act up sometimes. I'm only doing what any father would, keeping them in line, teaching them discipline." Betty's eyes hardened. Discipline doesn't create the kind of fear I saw in Leela's eyes. It's one thing to be firm with your children, but what you're doing is something else entirely. Tom's face twisted with anger, and he took a threatening step forward. "You think you know my family better than I do," he sneered. "I'm their father. I make the rules, and I don't need some nosy old woman telling me how to raise my children." Betty held her ground, refusing to flinch under his scrutiny. "I may be an old woman," she replied calmly, "but I know when something isn't right, and I won't stand by and do nothing while those girls suffer. If I have to call the authorities again, I will." For a moment, Tom looked as if he might strike her. His hands clenched into fists, his face contorted with rage. But then, as if realizing the gravity of his actions, he took a step back, forcing himself to regain control. He sneered, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "You're a fool, Mrs. Thompson," he spat. "You think you're helping, but you're only making things worse. You don't know the first thing about my family, or what we've been through. But if you keep this up, I promise you, you'll regret it." With that, he turned on his heel, storming back to the house. Melanie and Leela quickly moved out of his way, and he grabbed Melanie by the arm, pulling her roughly toward the door. The terrified look in Leela's eyes as she glanced back at Betty was enough to break her heart. As the door slammed shut, Betty stood there, frozen with shock and fear. She had faced many challenges in her life, but nothing quite like this. The desperation in Leela's eyes haunted her, and she knew she couldn't leave things as they were. This was more than a case of stern parenting or a difference in family values. There was something dark and sinister lurking in that house, and those girls were trapped in its grasp. Betty returned to her own home, her mind racing with thoughts of what she could do. She considered calling the police again, but she knew they wouldn't come twice without more concrete evidence. Her gaze drifted to the window overlooking her garden, where she could see the faint outline of the neighboring house through the twilight. An idea began to form in her mind, one that felt risky, even dangerous, but it was her only option. If she couldn't get the police involved, then she would have to gather the evidence herself. She would need to watch, to listen, to observe everything that happened in that house. She would wait for the right moment, the slip of a curtain, the crack of an open window, anything that might give her a glimpse into the truth. As night fell, Betty sat by her window, her gaze fixed on the house next door. She was prepared to wait as long as it took, to keep vigil until she found the proof she needed. She wasn't sure how long she would have to endure this, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't abandon those girls. Not now. Not ever. Hours passed, and the house remained silent. But as the clock struck midnight, she saw a faint light flicker in one of the upstairs windows. Her heart raced as she watched a shadow pass by the curtain, followed by the muffled sound of raised voices. The voices were too faint for her to make out the words, but she recognized the tone. Anger, frustration, and something that sounded dangerously close to despair. She watched as the shadow moved back and forth, pacing, gesturing, as though engaged in an argument with someone unseen. And then, in a moment that felt almost surreal, she saw the figure press a hand against the window, the silhouette of slender fingers splayed against the glass. It was Melanie. Her posture spoke of desperation, of a silent cry for help, a plea for someone to notice, to intervene. Betty's heart broke as she watched Melanie's silhouette vanish from the window, leaving the room dark once more. She knew she couldn't stop now. She would watch, she would wait, and when the moment came, she would act. She had no idea what lay ahead, but a plan unfolds. Betty spent the next day in a state of heightened vigilance, her eyes constantly drifting to the house next door. She went through her usual morning routines, brewing her coffee, watering her plants, and reading the paper, but her mind remained focused on one thing: Lila, Ivy, and their mother, Melanie. She was determined to find a way to help them, but she knew she had to be cautious. Tom's menacing presence loomed in her thoughts, a dark reminder of the danger she was stepping into. Betty knew she couldn't rely on the police alone. Last night's visit had made that abundantly clear. Tom had likely convinced them that nothing was wrong, that it was just a case of overprotective parenting, a misunderstanding. But Betty knew better. She had seen enough in her life to recognize genuine fear and desperation when it was right in front of her. After a restless night of planning, she decided on a course of action. If she could get closer to the family, build trust with Melanie and the girls, she might be able to help them without drawing Tom's suspicion. It was a delicate balance, one that required subtlety and patience, and she knew just where to start. That afternoon, Betty baked a fresh batch of cookies, filling her kitchen with the comforting aroma of chocolate and vanilla. She carefully arranged them on a plate, wrapping it with a colorful cloth, and took a deep breath. She knew this was her best chance to reach out to Melanie, to offer her a lifeline without raising any alarms. As she stepped outside, she cast a cautious glance toward the house, hoping Tom wouldn't be home. When she reached the front door, she knocked softly, her heart pounding in her chest. After a few tense moments, the door opened and Melanie stood before her, looking surprised but grateful. "Oh, Mrs. Thompson," Melanie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hello again." Betty offered her a warm smile, holding out the plate. "Hello, dear. I thought I'd bring you some cookies. I know moving can be a bit overwhelming, and I thought a little treat might make things easier." Melanie's eyes softened, and she took the plate with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. That's very kind of you." "Please call me Betty," she replied, her tone gentle. She hesitated, then added, "How are the girls? They seemed a bit overwhelmed when I saw them the other day." Melanie's smile faltered, and Betty could see the exhaustion and worry etched in her face. She glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to make sure no one was listening, before replying, "They're adjusting. It's been hard on them, especially with—" She trailed off, her voice catching, and Betty could see the unspoken pain in her eyes. Betty reached out, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "If there's anything I can do, please don't hesitate to let me know. I've lived here a long time, and I've seen my share of struggles. Sometimes it helps just to have someone to talk to." Melanie looked at her, her eyes filling with a mixture of gratitude and hesitation. For a moment, Betty thought she might open up, might share the burdens that weighed so heavily on her. But then, as if remembering something, Melanie's face clouded, and she nodded, her voice distant. "Thank you, Betty. I appreciate that," she said, her tone subdued. Just then, a noise came from inside the house, a loud, grating sound, like something being dragged across the floor. Melanie flinched, her eyes darting toward the hallway. She forced a smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "I should get back inside," she said quickly. "But thank you again for the cookies. The girls will love them." Betty nodded, sensing the urgency in her tone. "Of course, dear. Take care of yourself and the girls," she said gently. Melanie gave her a brief nod, then slipped back inside, closing the door softly behind her. Betty stood on the porch for a moment, a sinking feeling settling in her chest. Whatever was happening in that house, Melanie was trapped in it just as much as the girls were. As Betty returned to her own home, her mind raced with possibilities. She knew Melanie was in a difficult position, likely under Tom's control, afraid to reach out for help. But Betty was determined to find a way to bridge the gap, to offer Melanie a path to safety. She couldn't just sit by and let them suffer in silence. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Betty sat by her window, watching the house next door. She had an idea, a bold, risky idea that would require perfect timing. She waited, hoping for a sign that Tom had left the house, that Melanie and the girls were alone. She wasn't sure how long she'd have to wait, but she was prepared to stay up all night if necessary. Finally, around 8 o'clock, she saw Tom's car pull out of the driveway, his headlights cutting through the twilight as he drove off. Betty felt a surge of relief. This was her chance. She grabbed a small flashlight, tucked it into her pocket, and made her way next door, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She knocked softly, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. After a moment, the door opened, and Melanie stood there, looking surprised and slightly alarmed. "Betty," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "Is everything all right?" Betty nodded, keeping her voice low. "Yes, but I wanted to check on you. And the girls. I saw that Tom left, and I thought this might be a good time for us to talk, if that's all right." Melanie hesitated, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She cast a quick glance down the hallway, as if expecting Tom to return at any moment, before nodding and stepping aside to let Betty in. The house was dimly lit, with shadows stretching across the walls. Betty could feel the tension in the air, a palpable sense of fear that seemed to cling to every corner of the room. Melanie led her to the living room, where the twins sat on the couch, their faces pale and solemn. When they saw Betty, their eyes lit up with a spark of hope, and she felt a pang of sadness at the relief in their expressions. "Hello, dears," she said softly, giving them a warm smile. "I just wanted to check on you all, make sure everything's all right." The girls exchanged a look, their small hands clutching each other's tightly. Lila, the bolder of the two, looked up at Betty, her voice a barely audible whisper. "Are you going to help us?" Betty felt her heart break at the question, and she nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm going to do everything I can to help you." Melanie's face softened, and for the first time, Betty saw the true depth of her fear and desperation. She looked at Betty, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and anguish. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she admitted, her voice trembling. He controls everything. I'm trapped here, and so are the girls." Betty reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Listen to me, Melanie," she said firmly. "You're not alone. There are people who can help you, places you can go to be safe, but you have to trust me." Melanie nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I do, Betty. I don't know where to start. I'm so afraid of what he'll do if he finds out." Betty gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "We'll find a way," she promised. "But we need a plan. Somewhere safe for you and the girls to go, and someone who can help you get there." They spent the next hour talking quietly, formulating a plan. Betty would contact a local shelter, a place where Melanie and the girls could find safety and support. She would also speak to a family counselor she knew, someone who specialized in helping families escape abusive situations. Betty explained everything carefully, making sure Melanie understood each step. As they spoke, Leela and Ivy sat close by, listening intently. Betty could see the hope returning to their eyes, a flicker of light in the darkness that had enveloped them for so long. She knew this was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but it was a start, a path forward that could lead them to safety. Before Betty left, she knelt down beside the twins, looking into their young, hopeful faces. "Remember, if you ever need anything, you just come to me," she said softly. "I'll be right next door, and I'll keep watching over you. You're not alone." The girls nodded, their small hands clasping hers tightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," Ivy whispered, her voice filled with a fragile hope. Betty gave them a gentle smile, her heart swelling with a fierce determination. As she left the house, she cast a final glance back at the family she had come to care for so deeply. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and risks, but she was prepared to face them head-on. For Melanie, for Leela, for Ivy, she would fight with everything she had. That night, Betty lay in bed, her mind racing with plans and preparations. She knew Tom wouldn't give up easily, that he would do everything in his power to keep his control over them. But she was ready. She would gather every resource, every bit of strength and courage she possessed, to protect those girls and give them the life they deserved. And as the first light of dawn broke through her window, Betty knew that this was only the beginning. The battle had just begun, and she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. A new dawn. The following days were filled with tense anticipation and careful planning. Betty kept a close eye on the house next door, watching Tom's comings and goings, learning his schedule and habits. She felt like a spy, hiding behind her curtains and listening intently for any sounds of trouble. But she knew this was necessary. If she wanted to give Melanie and the girls a chance at escape, she had to be sure the timing was perfect. Each day, she made brief visits to Melanie, often under the pretense of bringing over small baked goods or helping with a household task. She could see the strain etched deeper into Melanie's face, but there was also a growing resolve. Leela and Ivy, too, seemed different, still quiet and cautious, but with a glimmer of hope in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Betty knew that hope was a fragile thing, easily shattered, and she did everything in her power to nurture it. One rainy afternoon, Betty received a phone call she had been waiting for. It was from Sandra, a counselor she knew through her church, a woman who specialized in helping families escape abusive situations. Betty had reached out to her days earlier, explaining the urgent need for a safe place for Melanie and her daughters. Sandra had listened patiently, assuring Betty that she would do everything possible to help. "Betty, I've arranged for a safe space at a shelter in the next town," Sandra explained, her voice calm and reassuring. "It's a women's shelter with security and resources to help them transition. They'll be safe there, but they'll need to arrive discreetly, without drawing attention." Betty felt a surge of relief wash over her. "Thank you, Sandra. I can't tell you how much this means to me, and to them." Sandra's voice softened. "You're doing a wonderful thing, Betty. Just make sure they're ready. Once they're there, they'll have access to legal assistance, counseling, and everything they need to rebuild." As she hung up, Betty knew the time had come to put their plan into action. That evening, she made her way next door, bracing herself for what she hoped would be the final time she had to see Tom's domineering face. She knocked on the door, and after a few moments, Melanie answered, her face filled with quiet determination. "Betty," she greeted, her voice low and controlled. "Come in, please." Betty stepped inside, exchanging a brief nod with Melanie before they moved to the kitchen, where the twins were seated at the table, their small hands clasped tightly together. Betty knelt down beside them, giving each girl a gentle smile. "Hello, dears," she said softly. "Are you ready for a little adventure?" The girls nodded, their eyes wide with both fear and anticipation. Betty took a deep breath, steeling herself for the next step. She turned to Melanie, who looked like she was on the verge of breaking down, yet managed to hold herself together. "I've arranged everything," Betty told her quietly. "There's a shelter waiting for you in the next town. They have resources, support, everything you'll need to make a fresh start." Melanie's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to squeeze Betty's hand. "Thank you, Betty," she whispered. I never thought anyone would care enough to help us." Betty's heart ached at her words, and she gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're not alone, Melanie. And once you're there, you'll have people who will make sure you're safe. But we need to move quickly." Just then, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway sent a jolt of fear through the room. Melanie's face went pale, and the girls clung to each other, their eyes wide with terror. Betty glanced out the window, her heart sinking as she saw Tom's car. He was back earlier than she had expected, his stern face visible even from a distance. "Go upstairs," Betty whispered urgently, turning to Melanie. "Get your things together. Take only what you need. I'll distract him." Melanie nodded, ushering the girls up the stairs as quietly as possible. Betty took a deep breath, steadying herself as she prepared to face Tom one last time. The front door opened, and Tom stepped inside, his gaze narrowing as he spotted Betty standing in the hallway. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his tone laced with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" Betty forced a warm smile, trying to keep her voice calm and casual. "Oh, Tom, I just thought I'd bring over some extra casserole. I know Melanie's been so busy with the move, and I thought a home-cooked meal might help." Tom's eyes narrowed further, his expression darkening. "That's considerate of you, but we don't need any charity." Betty felt a flicker of fear, but she held her ground. "Nonsense. It's no trouble at all," she said, her tone firm. "I know how difficult it can be to settle in." Tom studied her for a moment, as though trying to read her intentions, but finally shrugged, seeming to dismiss her presence as harmless. "Fine," he muttered. "Leave it in the kitchen. I'll be in the garage." As he turned to leave, Betty felt a wave of relief. She watched him go, her heart pounding as she heard the garage door open and close. She wasted no time, hurrying upstairs to find Melanie and the girls, who were anxiously waiting in the small bedroom. "Let's go," Betty whispered, her voice filled with urgency. "We don't have much time." Melanie nodded, grabbing a small bag she had packed with essentials. Layla and Heidi clutched each other's hands tightly, their faces pale but resolute. Betty led them quietly down the stairs, casting a final glance toward the garage to ensure that Tom hadn't returned. She ushered them out the back door, guiding them through the garden and toward her own house, where her car was parked. Once they reached her car, Betty opened the back door, helping the girls climb inside. Melanie slid in beside them, her face filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Betty climbed into the driver's seat, her hand steady on the wheel as she started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. They drove in silence for a while, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Betty kept her eyes on the road, glancing occasionally in the rearview mirror to check on Melanie and the girls. She could see the tension in their faces, the fear that lingered despite their escape. But there was also a glimmer of hope, a small spark that gave Betty the strength to keep going. As they reached the outskirts of town, Betty felt a sense of relief wash over her. They were almost there, almost to safety. She knew there would be challenges ahead, that Melanie and the girls would need time to heal and rebuild their lives. But she also knew they had taken the first step, that they had finally broken free from the grip of fear and control that had held them captive for so long. When they arrived at the shelter, Sandra was waiting for them, her warm smile and gentle demeanor offering a sense of reassurance. She helped Melanie and the girls out of the car, guiding them inside with a kindness that put Betty's heart at ease. Betty embraced each of them, feeling a mix of sadness and pride as she said her goodbyes. Layla and Heidi hugged her tightly, their small arms wrapped around her like a lifeline, and Melanie gave her a grateful smile, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Betty," she whispered. "You saved us." Betty placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, her own eyes misting over. "You're stronger than you know, Melanie. And you're going to be all right. All of you." With a final, reassuring smile, Betty watched as Sandra led them inside, disappearing through the doors of the shelter. She stood there for a moment, a sense of peace settling over her as she took in the quiet street, the early morning light casting a soft glow over the world. As she drove back home, Betty felt a mixture of emotions, relief, pride, and a deep gratitude for the strength she had found within herself. She knew the journey for Melanie and her daughters was just beginning, that they would face struggles and hardships along the way. But they were free now, and that was the most important thing. Back in her own home, Betty sat in her cozy armchair, looking out at the empty house next door. The street was quiet, as it always had been, but it felt different now. She knew she had made a difference, that she had given those girls a chance at a better life, and that knowledge filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. As she sipped her tea, Betty felt a warm glow in her chest, a reminder that even in the smallest acts of kindness, there was a power that could change lives. She had been just a neighbor, an old woman with no great strength or influence, but she had chosen to act, to stand up against the darkness. In that moment, Betty knew she would carry this memory with her always, a reminder that compassion, courage, and love could overcome even the deepest fears. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, she closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest, knowing that she had done something truly extraordinary.